that abduction is ignorance preserving, do they really, what exactly do they mean by this? Do they mean ignorance preserving in contrast to knowledge enhancing, or ignorance preserving, which in such is knowledge enhancing? In which case?
No, excuse me, repeat the last.
So when they say that abduction is ignorance preserving, what do they exactly mean? Is this because ignorance preserving can be also knowledge enhancing? Yeah. It's like Heuristic reasoning as such. So what do they exactly mean when they say that?
So they mean that they are strongly related to the idea of abduction, like abduction works in the case of medical reasoning, diagnosis, or scientific reasoning. So they think that you are making abduction because you are ignorant of something. But when you are making abduction, you can have a kind of mitigation of your ignorance, okay, but not complete, because you need the experimental aspect. In reality, this is the concept that they have. In reality, we have seen that sometimes it is absolutely not ignorance preserving, because through abduction, without experimental trial, we reach new knowledge. Because you directly build new knowledge. This is the reason I quoted Kant. No? So, I think that this is an acceptable explanation of Gabay and Wood's idea. But also John Wood changed his idea recently, recognizing that there are aspects that are heuristically immediately knowledge enhancing. That is the idea of Charles Sanders. Charles Sanders Peirce always said that abduction is akin to truth. He also provided evolutionary justification, also theological justification, and also evolutionary theological, and also a synechist justification. No? But these are philosophical, metaphysical justifications. Also the evolutionary one is not acceptable today. But anyway, he was absolutely convinced that is akin to truth. That is immediately you can grasp through abduction something through rapidly. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, what if your problem is just to find out, how possibly an explanation? I mean, I'm piggybacking on Junior's question, basically, in that it seems to me knowledge is being equated, as I think you said, with sort of traditional confirmation theory, empirical confirmation or something. But if your problem, and this often comes up in the sciences and elsewhere, just how possibly could this be? Then abduction can give you that knowledge. It doesn't establish that is the actual explanation, but it does provide you the knowledge of here is a possibility. And I think it disagrees with what you say later in the paper. I had a separate question too, but
yeah. So,
does that make sense?
Did you follow the presentation yesterday of Carlo Cellucci? He was speaking about.
The German.
Yeah. No, but it was
I was forced to listen.
It was a rhetorical. Okay. So he explained wonderfully many aspects that are ways, methods for making abduction from the Persian point of view. For instance, analogy, metaphor. I could add a thought experiment. I could add also what I call, that is presently, implicitly in Peirce, manipulative abduction, where you are thinking through doing, manipulating the world, and these are all. Peirce was particularly paid attention to the diagram-based abduction, because also invented this aspect in logic, and so he was particularly paid attention to the role of that. These are always ways of making abduction, that if you see in science the abductions that are made using these possible tools, then they preserve your ignorance because you are waiting for the empirical test. But I try to show some examples where the empirical test is not necessary, is not important.
Even where ultimately you would like it, it seems to me, it's partly a verbal dispute, but it seems to me the state of knowledge in this old sense is biases the whole conception of learning and increase in certain ways by excluding other things from counting as knowledge. So, I can see there is a distinction here, but I would think two kinds of knowledge are two different sorts of.
It is a Kantian
You're
problem.
learning something, clearly.
It is
Or
not
to find one possible explanation that you didn't have before.
So
May I
you
ask
say
a
that
different question? The distinction between ignorance preserving and, the distinction between creative and selective abduction.
yeah.
How absolute is that distinction? Because it seems to me there's a blurred, sliding scale that even in selective, you have this idea that you have a library of models, like in case-based reasoning or something. But if you look at it from the Mino point of view, you still have to recognize, that a certain model applies to this case. And we can find very interesting cases in the history of science, the history of other fields, where it's not obvious. There are cognitive barriers of various kinds. Let me just, because it's familiar, use the series of examples of the genealogy of exemplar uses in, say, Kuhn's postscript, starting with Galileo's pendulum, since we were talking about Galileo. Huygens comes along to treat the physical pendulum and sees, we can treat the physical pendulum as just a sort of clustering of idealized Galileans, single pendulum, and treat the physical pendulum. And then in the next century, Bernoulli, one of the many Bernoullis.
Jakob Johann.
Says you can actually model the flow of fluid from an orifice in a tank using the pendulum idea. But even just to recognize, I'd say lightning is electrical discharge. Well, sure, once you know, it's clear. But to recognize that identification is itself quite a creative act in certain respects, in terms of solving the Mino problem of learning, it seems to me. So I just don't see that there's an absolute distinction there, that it's just a routine model of applying something in your library in one case and creating something totally different. Your Kepler example, I think you used Kepler's orbit as a creative abduction, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But can't you look at it from another point of view and say, well, we had the conic sections from the Greeks. All he had to do was go through those and see a circle, no, a square, no, ellipse, yes. But obviously it was not that simple. So it seems to me, again, it's a useful distinction, but it seems to me it can be applied in a too severe way that
I can answer in this way, that it is also pretty obvious answer. So you perfectly know that when we have to deal with some extinctions, we have to disrespect some aspect that, for instance, in this case, come from the history of science.
the distinction is
Also, Popperian falsificationism, from the point of view of the history of science, was extremely problematic. I can add another aspect, that there are many big cases that are also for example, the cases that were present to the artificial intelligence and scientists, where the distinction between creative and selective abduction is clear. There is also another aspect that is more psychological. For instance, when you learn, for instance, to solve a geometrical problem at school, you are in some sense creative, because it is the first time that you are building the solution of a problem from your individual point of view, even if that problem, from the point of view of the history of knowledge and history of science, was absolutely already solved, so you are not original. So this is another distinction that we can make, but I basically agree with you that the distinction has to be worked, and it is necessary to see various fuzzy aspects of the distinction that especially arise if you see the history of science, but also some psychological aspects, like the one that I explained now.
Yeah.
Okay. It's just more a curiosity. You mentioned analogy. Peirce, in his first syllogistic phase of his speculation on abduction, reduced analogic inference to abduction plus deduction. Do you agree that in some sense, and if yes, which sense, analogy can be subsumed under abduction?
Okay, so I do not agree with this kind of just understood, because my attitude with respect to Peirce is not the attitude of a historian of science, because I am not a historian of philosophy of science. My use of Peirce is free, and I adopt the responsibility of any damage to the reputation of Charles Sanders.
Do you agree with analogy as abduction?
I don't think that is particularly interesting today, in the sense that today, okay, so you can maintain the concept of abduction because it is useful, and you can see that it is useful, it is synthetic, it unifies many aspects and so on. It is even simplifying, like in the case of creative and selective abduction, but you know, often simplification is also a Cartesian clarity. Okay. I think that in this case you can maintain the concept of abduction, abandon the problem of the syllogistic models of abduction used by Peirce, abandon the perspective on analogy of Peirce, but checking the rich research that is in some cases also logically related in cognitive science about analogy. There is a book by Paul Taggart, there is Deidre Gertner that work on analogy, and there is a rich knowledge, recent, updated, about the role of analogy in making hypotheses in scientific reasoning. Paul Taggart also speaks of abduction. For instance, Deidre Gertner, she doesn't use the word abduction because she's just interested in analogy. But I think that this is the best way. So in this case of analogy, the best are the research in cognitive science. That many of them are not psychologically oriented. Okay, that there is an experiment with 100 people, and you say they make the analogy in a good way, they make the analogy. Some of them are very theoretically rich. Okay.
Oh, sorry. No.
Well, because one was a clarification question, perhaps, was before. I'd say, why do you need to reintroduce induction? This reversal what I thought to understand about induction. So it's there is a logically sustainable way to go in the inductive direction without falling into the golden box of induction as faulty reasoning. So why do you introduce the inductive induction? abduction as a Hansen version never allowed any inference to the best explanation, just one possibility. So that's one question. That was another completely different question. Was in state that related to be creative. Of course, also going back to my presentation, I think that this idea that model building abduction rather than pattern recognition, which is roughly the difference, I think, behind it, is not rare. It seems to be rare only because we are concerned about grand innovation. Of course, grand innovations are rare, but diagnosis, model building on a small scale, out of science, in production, improving craftsmanship, mother diagnosis rather than physician diagnosis of the disease of the kid is full of good abduction. But we don't study the good abduction because they work. They don't provoke problems. So we think they are rare, but I think they are not rare. Well, perhaps they are not rare. We don't make the statistics of the good abduction because it works. Well, we are very concerned with the bad because they provoke accidents and problems. Why do you think it's rare?
No, so I think that they are rare, the good abductions.
Well, that's what you say.
I think that they are rare, the good creative abduction, because people are not keen to make creative abduction. So you see, yesterday we said that it is in the last 20 years there is a diminution of creativity in science. So human beings are not particularly intelligent in general. So this is not necessary.
Excluding
How can you
participants.
test this?
No, but also including the present. I am not Immanuel Kant. When I say intelligent, I am referring to Immanuel Kant, so to these people. No, but I am kidding a bit. The problem of induction. Okay, induction is traditionally considered the generalization. Okay, what is the problem of induction? And Intica agrees with this Persian ideas about induction, that when you are making an induction, it is a generalization, so it is not particularly creative. For instance, through induction, you cannot explain why some scientific discovery are built using mathematical equations. The law of universal gravitation, it is difficult to explain this law using induction.
I thought induction was banned from the realm of logic. Is that wrong?
No, there is a lot of research on induction.
No.
There is the inductive law.
Popper,
Well,
who said so? Simon, a bunch of not stupid guys saying
No, Simon, no, it is among the intelligent.
In the sense that you can infer. In that sense,
No, there is a
but
rich
you
research.
cannot say every inference is deductive. There are many kinds of other reasoning, which is, sorry.
It is also technologically useful because basically from the epistemological point of view, when you see the result of the elections on television, the estimation is there based on induction, of course using artifacts, statistics, mathematical, but this is basically induction. But induction is not able to explain more creative aspects. It can explain more creative aspects of reasoning if you extend the idea of induction, like John Stuart Mill did from some perspective, and then in that case, okay, induction by analogy. So induction in this case is, but I follow Intica in this case, it is better to use the word abduction because it is okay. But induction is still
No,
alive.
it's still not
It's
it's
still
still
alive.
logical.
Still a run. There is also the inductive logic of Rudolf Carlo, the traditional Carlo. But the word induction used by Peirce in the case of the testing of hypotheses is also another meaning of the word induction, because it refers to the fact that you go to inductively check cases to confirm or disconfirm your hypothesis. That is, for instance, that is what John Stuart Mill called eliminative induction. So you are looking for a possible falsification.
Another example. Yes.
So it is another meaning of the word induction. In Tika says it is not a real good term in this case.
Well, I have a question back. There is Fabio's perspective.
The question is, the distinction between creative and selective abduction, because as I understand the problem is to describe I can reach the creative hypothesis in abduction. And when some author try to describe this process, they use always unpredicted inference rules, which are not abduction. So it seems to me that creative abduction can be described as an inference which gives you the hypothesis and then traditional abduction. So I cannot understand why to continue to call them creative abduction if the creative part of the abduction is not abductive, is not described as can be described as an abduction. This is a problem even in Peirce, because in Peirce the hypothesis is generated by an insight, because God gave us faculty to
It is the theistic explanation. There is also the evolutionary one, the pluralistic.
This author who defend this distinction between abductive and selective abduction, give example of creative abduction. There is the creative part, which is always an inference rule as an analogy or induction, and then an abduction. So this is my problem. Then the problem is when you said for Peirce everything is a sign, and sign is whatever can stand for something else. So my problem is, don't you think that there is a regressive infinitum because even if you see abduction from another point of view, as you said, for example, emotion, even if they are signs, you will always get a step over and over, because even emotions will stand for something else. And this is something the problem in Peirce is the link between our semiosis and the world. So, and the way to link this kind of processes, even in Peirce are good, but I don't know if you think that the architecture of our reasoning process will be stand with this stronger for the metaphysical process.
Complicated questions, but I try to answer quickly. So,
look, we have coffee.
So,
Anyway,
I
so
said
it's a complicated
No,
the
quick.
question and the answer.
No, I said that I try to answer quickly. So in the first case, I think that you have to be less akin to the Persian text and to the fact that there are contradictions and so on. So if you see abduction following many Persian passages, abduction is basically a kind of anti-ethic cognition, because in these cases, Peirce is not interested in a logical perspective on abduction, because when Peirce deals with the syllogistic model of abduction, he is referring basically to the selective abduction, so to the fact that you already have hypotheses, but there are so many that you to choose the correct one. For instance, in the fallacy of affirming the consequent, it is the fact that it is possible that you have that adaptive result, but you can have many other results already available. So the other aspect that is more related to the semiotic, philosophical perspective of Peirce immediately sees abduction as a kind of appiative reason, where the fact that you ampliate cognition derives from the exploitation of many cognitive tools that can be logical rules, diagrams, manipulation of the words, thought experiments, analogies, and so on, they work like a life of science in Persian. So in this case I said it is an anticipation of the cognitive third. In cognitive science, you pay attention to the whole arena of tools that can use for reason. The second aspect was, I already answered in some sense. Don't fear the regress ad infinitum, because if you see the activity of cognition of a human in a naturalistic way, you have to abandon in this case the epistemological or logical rigid perspectives that are of course useful and wonderful in other cases, but in the case you have to abandon. Imagine you are a cat or your dog. Is your cat able to make abductions? Following the researchers in animal cognition, cats and dogs are able to make abductions, and so to say, using an anthropomorphic version to make explanation of the situation. Are they using words? No. Are they using logical inference? No. Are they using model-based ways of cognition that are similar to ours, like, for example, visualization, emotions? Yes, in this case we share, and the result is a cognitive result, also in the case of this animal, even if they, at least we guess, they do not use verbal aspects or logical. They do not use modus ponens. They may be, there is a research that some animals are able to perform modus ponens, but they do not have the rule, the logical rule. It is in action. Okay.
I think we have to have a coffee break because I have questions for you, but
Io with the coffee.
Per tutti i coffee break,
Ah sì, è quello, se puoi rinunciare. Sei generoso.
I think you're right.
Sì, sì.